The fog was thick enough to chew on, a clammy, silent presence that swallowed the streetlights whole. It was the kind of fog that didn't roll in, it simply was, like a sudden, opaque shroud dropped over the city of Stonehaven. Detective Elias Thorne sat hunched in his worn sedan, the lukewarm coffee doing little to cut through the chill that had settled deep in his bones. He wasn't on duty, not officially, but a low-priority missing persons case had been ticking away at the edges of his mind for 3 days. A young college student, Sarah Miller, vanished from her apartment near the old Blackwood Library. No signs of struggle, no forced entry, just a half-eaten bowl of cereal on the counter and an open textbook. Elias had seen 100 disappearances, but this one felt empty. Not a blank page, but a page with the text rubbed out, leaving a faint, unsettling residue. His partner, Officer Ben Carter, a solid man 2 decades his junior, tapped on the passenger window, his breath pluming white. Elias rolled it down. "Anything, Ben?" Ben shook his head, the mist clinging to his uniform. "Nothing. Landlord says she was quiet. Neighbors didn't hear a damn thing. Phone pinged near the library's old underground archives, then went dark. It's a dead zone down there, you know that." "Yeah, I know," Elias muttered, staring at the Gothic spire of the library, barely visible through the white haze. The Blackwood Library wasn't just old, it was built on the site of Stonehaven's original city asylum, which had mysteriously burned down in the 1920s. Local legend said the asylum's unhinged patients and their dark secrets were simply buried beneath the new foundation. "The weird thing, Elias," Ben continued, his voice dropping, "is the archive. It's been locked up for 20 years. Flooded. Nothing down there but moldy city records and rats. But the vault door. It was open when the campus security checked. No sign of Sarah, but the door was definitely jimmied. Cleanly. Like they used a special tool." Elias felt a cold spike of interest override his fatigue. Jimmied? So she didn't wander off. Someone took her, and they went in. Or she went in herself, Ben countered, looking uneasy. Her laptop was open to a forum. About local folklore. Specifically, the whispering clock, in the library's archive. Supposedly, an old clock from the asylum that, when wound, lets you hear the final thoughts of the dead. Elias scoffed. A ghost story. Yeah, but the last post she saw. It was a map. Hand-drawn. Leads right to the sub-basement vault. Elias pushed open his car door, the sharp click of the latch loud in the silence. The library entrance was sealed with yellow tape. "Call CSU," he instructed. "We need to get underground. And grab the radio. I want to try that dead zone one more time." They descended a flight of crumbling stone stairs behind a service panel, the air growing colder, heavier, smelling of wet earth and something metallic, like old pennies. Ben shone his powerful flashlight down a long, dripping corridor. At the end stood a massive, circular steel door, the vault. It hung ajar, a black crescent in the stone wall. "CSU won't be here for an hour," Ben whispered. "Should we wait?" Elias had already stepped over the threshold. The air inside the archive was suffocatingly still. Rows of metal shelving towered into the darkness, lined with boxes of municipal history that no one cared about. "We don't have an hour, Ben. If she was down here looking for a clock, then what the hell else did she find?" He raised the police radio to his mouth. "Unit 31 to Central. Testing comms from Blackwood sublevel. Do you copy?" Silence. Only the wet sound of their own footsteps. Suddenly, a faint, high-pitched static burst from the radio speaker, not the usual white noise, but a sharp, rhythmic hiss that quickly resolved into something else. It was a voice. Not Sarah's, not Central's. It was garbled, fractured, but undeniably human, and it was weeping. Ben jumped, dropping his flashlight, which rolled under a shelf. Elias froze, his thumb already on the transmit button. The crying intensified, punctuated by a sound like a small, antique clock ticking rapidly, tick 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 tick. Then, the garbled voice screamed a single, crystal-clear word that cut through the static, a word that felt like an ice pick to the back of Elias's neck: stop. And then, silence. Just the dead air of the archive, now feeling impossibly vast and deep. Elias stared at his radio, his heart hammering against his ribs. What was that? Ben stammered, scrambling for his light. That wasn't the dead zone, Elias breathed. That was a transmission. And it came from closer than Central. He gripped his flashlight tighter, turning slowly toward the deeper shadows of the archive. The metallic smell was overpowering now, mixed with a faint, sweet, decaying scent that he didn't need to check his radio again. The sound he was hearing wasn't coming from the device. It was an echo in the concrete. Tick dash tick dash tick dash tick dash tick. It was the whispering clock. And it wasn't behind them. It was somewhere deeper in the darkness. The ticking was faint but relentless, like a tiny hammer striking the inside of Elias's skull. It wasn't the rhythmic thump-thump of a normal clock, it was a frenetic, almost desperate tick-tick-tick-tick, speeding up and slowing down with an unnerving, organic irregularity. Elias, Ben whispered, gripping his service pistol, the beam of his recovered flashlight shaking. That voice, it sounded like it was right next to us. It wasn't, Elias replied, his voice low and tight. He was focused on the source of the ticking. It was through the radio, but something in this vault amplified it. Or maybe it pulled it. Look. He pointed his light at the wall to their left. The concrete here was newer, a patch job, but unlike the rest of the rough, damp surface, this section was covered in strange, shallow scorch marks and faint scratches. Amidst the damage, Elias saw a seam, a hidden door, crudely sealed. "This is not on the blueprints," he murmured, running his gloved hand over the cold cement. "This vault has a secret room. Ben, help me find a weak point." They worked quickly, their movements jerky with adrenaline. After a few tense minutes, Ben found a small, rusted iron handle half buried in the concrete near the floor. Together, they braced their feet and pulled, with a grinding groan of metal against stone and a puff of sickeningly dusty air, the section of the wall swung inward, revealing a cramped, pitch-black passage. The air that rushed out hit them like a physical blow. It was stagnant, thick with the smell of ozone, dried blood, and something impossibly old, and the ticking was deafening. Elias drew his weapon and led the way, his flashlight cutting a shaky path. The passage was narrow, lined with exposed, brittle pipes and electrical conduits. It sloped downward sharply, ending in another small, iron-banded wooden door. Affixed to this door, right at eye level, was the clock. It was an antique piece, no bigger than a saucer, made of tarnished brass and dark wood. The glass was cracked, the hands frozen at an impossible time. But it was definitely ticking, its small, rusted gears churning wildly, vibrating with furious, internal energy. "The whispering clock," Ben breathed, wide-eyed. "It's not whispering," Elias corrected, his voice flat. "It's screaming." He reached out, hesitation battling duty, and pushed the clock gently aside. The wooden door wasn't locked. He eased it open, the beam of his flashlight plunged into a small, circular chamber. The room was not built for records, it was built for confinement. The walls were lined with heavy, rusted chains bolted to the stone, and the floor was stained with dark, concentric rings, but it was what was in the center of the room that made both officers stumble back. Sarah Miller was there. She was alive, sitting perfectly still in the middle of the floor, her back against a rough stone pillar. Her eyes were wide open, fixed on a spot just above Elias's head, unblinking. Her clothes were intact, untouched, except for her hands were clasped tightly around a thick, antique leather book lying open on her lap. Her fingernails were bloody, the skin raw, as if she had been desperately clawing at the pages. "Sarah! Police! We're getting you out of here!" Elias shouted, dropping his gun hand slightly and rushing forward. As he moved, Ben pulled his attention away from the girl to scan the chamber. "Wait, Elias, look at the pillar." Elias stopped abruptly, his light following Ben's beam to the stone pillar behind Sarah. It wasn't just a pillar. Scratched, carved, and smeared onto the surface were dozens of crude faces. They were abstract, almost childish drawings, yet they conveyed pure, unadulterated terror, mouths open in soundless screams, eyes wide with incomprehension. They were overlapping, layered, some fresh, some ancient, like a crowd of silent victims trapped in the stone, and as Elias stared, the rhythmic ticking from the clock on the door suddenly stopped. The absolute silence that followed was worse than the noise. Sarah Miller's head slowly, mechanically, turned to face them. Her eyes, still wide, were clouded, but a faint, knowing smile stretched her lips. Then, the smile vanished. Her face contorted, and from her throat came a guttural, wet sound, not of her own voice, but the same fractured, garbled cry they had heard on the radio, echoing the word, "Stop." Her mouth was moving, but the sound wasn't coming from her. It was coming from the open book on her lap. As the terrible sound filled the chamber, the leather book began to vibrate violently, and the bloody scratches on Sarah's hands deepened, fresh crimson welling up. Elias didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, not for Sarah, but for the book. He had to close it, but before his hands could reach the leather cover, a final, horrifying detail registered. One of the scratched faces on the stone pillar, a new one, faint and unfinished, had its mouth open in a perfect oval of panic. It was a face he knew. It was the distorted, terrified face of Sarah Miller. As he touched the book, he felt a crushing, agonizing pressure against his eardrums, and the air shimmered, filled with the combined whispers of every face on the wall, a chaotic, desperate chorus of final, unspeakable thoughts. The chamber plunged into blackness as Ben's flashlight suddenly died. Flicker. Elias was left alone in the cold, thick dark, the weight of 1,000 dying whispers pressing down on him, and the chilling realization that Sarah hadn't been confined in this room, she was the bait. The sudden, absolute darkness was a weapon. Elias felt the cold grip of panic, not for the danger, but for the swift, total loss of his senses. He instinctively threw his weight backward, pulling his hands away from the vibrating book. As he retreated, he slammed hard into Officer Ben Carter. "Ben, where's your light?" Elias barked, his voice raw. The chaotic, multi-layered whispers still echoed in the small chamber, pressing in on him. They sounded like 1,000 flies trapped in a jar, the air vibrating with their silent, dying thoughts. "It died." Ben choked out. "Just, gone." And Elias, the door. The main vault door. Elias spun back towards the exit, fumbling for the small penlight on his belt. The heavy, circular steel door of the archive vault, which had been left ajar, was now slowly, agonizingly grinding shut. The sound of steel on steel was a screech of finality, silencing the whispers momentarily. They were trapped in the sub-basement with the unmoving girl and the horrifying, whispering book. Elias finally clicked on his penlight. The weak beam barely pierced the gloom, but it was enough to see. Sarah Miller was still sitting upright, the book open on her lap. Her eyes followed the faint light, a chilling, vacant malice in their depths. The secondary door. The wooden one. Elias yelled, pointing the penlight at the small, narrow exit they had entered through. Ben, his face pale and slick with cold sweat, scrambled to the wooden door. The whispering clock, which had stopped ticking, now lay shattered on the stone floor, its brass gears scattered like broken teeth. He tried the handle, locked. No. It can't be. It was unlocked. Ben slammed his shoulder against the brittle wood, but the iron bands held firm. Elias ran to the hidden passage they had uncovered. The mechanism. There has to be a latch, something. His penlight scanned the seams of the hidden wall. He found nothing but cold, scarred concrete. He paused, his light lingering on the stone pillar where Sarah's freshly carved face lay, forever trapped in a soundless scream. The metallic, coppery smell of blood was stronger now. Elias looked down at the concrete floor beneath the girl. The dark, concentric rings weren't just stains. They were runes, carved into the floor of the chamber, now slick with a fresh, viscous fluid. The lines of the runes glowed faintly, a dull, sickly amber in the dim light, and then he noticed the book again. The old leather cover, once brittle and dry, was now plump and dark, its surface slowly undulating. Ben, stop with the door. Get away from her. Elias shouted, his police training screaming the word containment. Ben turned back, his eyes wide. What is it? The book, Elias said, his voice dropping to a near-silent gravel. It's not a record. It's a receiver. And the chamber, it's charging. He pointed his weak light at the open book on Sarah's lap. The pages, covered in dense, spidery script, were no longer just ink. They were moving. The ink seemed to be flowing, like thick oil, forming new words, new diagrams. Suddenly, Sarah's vacant eyes darted to Ben, and the garbled, wet scream from the book returned, not just the word, stop, but a torrent of foreign, clicking syllables that twisted and bent the air. Ben clutched his head, groaning in pain. It's loud, Elias. It's too loud. Elias saw what was happening. As the sound intensified, the faces carved into the pillar began to grow deeper, the fresh scratch marks of Sarah's face sinking further into the stone, becoming more defined, more real. The book was extracting something, and it was using Sarah to channel it. Thinking fast, Elias tossed his penlight at the book. It hit the leather cover with a dull thud, startling Sarah. She flinched, and for a split second, the look in her eyes wasn't malice or vacancy. It was a flash of pure, terrified lucidity. Run, she screamed, her own voice, before the horrific, clicking voice from the book surged back, drowning her out. Elias didn't hesitate. He grabbed Ben and pulled him back toward the vault door, which was now only a foot from ceiling shut. We go now. Before she's gone for good. He shoved Ben through the gap. As Elias threw himself after him, he glanced back one last time. Sarah Miller was clawing at her own chest, trying to tear the book away from her body, but it was too late. The vault door slammed shut with a final, bone-jarring clang. The sound echoed into absolute silence. Elias and Ben were in the outer corridor, trapped between two sealed doors. They were safe, but Sarah was locked inside the horrific chamber. Elias slumped against the cold steel, gasping, the taste of ozone and decay still on his tongue. We sealed her in, Ben whispered, horrified. Elias stared at the unyielding, riveted steel of the vault. The silence was unnerving. He lifted his radio again, hoping the door hadn't killed the signal completely. Central, this is Unit 31. Urgent backup required. Blackwood Library sublevel. We have an active scene and a suspect containment. Advise ETA for extraction team. The speaker hissed with static, then Central's calm, bored voice cut through. Unit 31, your radio is barely reading. Did you say, suspect contained? Elias started to answer, but before he could, a new sound began, not the frantic ticking, not the desperate weeping, but a slow, deliberate scratching that was coming from the inside of the massive vault door, right where his head rested. Scratch. Pause. Scratch. Pause. Scratch. It was a sound of something desperate, confined, and with terrible patience, trying to get out. It was carving the cold, hard steel. Elias pushed himself away from the door, his eyes wide with a new, deep horror. Whatever the book had consumed from Sarah Miller, it wasn't just memories or thoughts. It was power. And it was awake. The terrifying situation has now escalated, trapping the entity and Sarah inside the vault while Elias and Ben are trapped in the corridor. The scratched metal indicates the entity is adapting. Elias and Ben stood shoulder to shoulder in the dank corridor, their flashlights dead, the silence between them thick with adrenaline and terror. The only sound was the chilling, metallic scratching coming from the inside of the 3-foot-thick vault door. Scratch. 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 It sounded like a massive, hungry animal with steel claws, yet its rhythm was strangely measured, almost intelligent. Central, respond. Unit 31, repeat, we are pinned down in the Blackwood Library sublevel. Requesting EOD or a specialized breach team now. The environment is compromised. Elias spoke urgently into the police radio, the radio crackled, then Ben's voice, faint and distorted, came through the static. Elias realized the door was acting like a giant sound mirror, reflecting their own words. Elias, that was you. The radio, it's still only picking up local echo. The door sealed the signal completely. They were in a stone box, separated from the horror by a temporary layer of steel, and completely cut off from the outside world. Elias sank down, his back hitting the cold stone wall, desperately trying to think. Think, Ben. What did the map say? What was Sarah looking for besides the clock? Ben fumbled in his pocket, pulling out a wrinkled, sweat-damp photograph of the hand-drawn map. He activated the screen of his phone, its flashlight function still worked, providing a weak, directional beam. It's rough. Just floor plans of the sublevels. The vault, the main archive, and then this section. He pointed a shaky finger at a section of the map next to their current location, marked with a heavy X and the word, the furnace. The furnace? Elias echoed. That's the old Asylum incinerator, isn't it? Used to dispose of medical waste, maybe bodies back in the day. He shuddered, remembering the city's grim history. It's further down this hall, Ben confirmed, his eyes wide. But the vault door is between us and the way back up. We have to go deeper. The scratching on the steel vault door grew louder, more frantic. It was no longer a gentle scrape, it was a tearing sound, followed by a faint, high-pitched whine, the sound of stressed metal. Elias stood up, drawing his weapon. We can't stay here. If whatever's in there breaches this door, we're done. We go to the furnace. Maybe there's another exit, a vent, a flue, anything. As they moved silently down the corridor, their limited light beams danced across the floor, illuminating strange, wet streaks leading away from the vault. Elias bent down, shining his light closer. Ben, look at this. These aren't water trails. The streaks were dark, gelatinous, and moved in odd, pulsing currents, like something organic and cold. They led toward a heavy, riveted iron hatch in the floor. Suddenly, the scratching behind them stopped. The absolute, deafening silence that returned made Elias's nerves snap taut. He knew the sudden cessation of noise meant only one thing: observation. Scratch. Scrape. Clang. A heavy, sickening impact reverberated through the steel vault door, shaking the very concrete floor beneath their feet. A low, distorted hissing followed, a sound like steam escaping a pressurized pipe, but colder, more malignant. "It's coming through!" Ben screamed, pointing at the vault door. A hairline fissure, glowing with that same sickly amber light they had seen in the confinement chamber, was snaking across the center of the steel. "The hatch! Now!" Elias yelled, rushing to the iron disc in the floor. Ben frantically wrestled with the rusted handle. The metal groaned, but refused to budge. Elias joined him, and together, with a desperate surge of strength, they wrenched the hatch open. That a burst of hot, cloying air, smelling strongly of sulfur and burning human hair, erupted from the opening. The chamber below was black, deeper than anything they had seen. Elias went first, dropping through the opening and landing hard on a cold, dusty surface. He quickly looked up. Ben was halfway through the hatch when they both heard it. The vault door behind them groaned open about an inch, a horrific gap in the steel, and from that gap, a single, impossible sound emerged. Not the screams, not the weeping, but a perfectly clear, melodious humming. It was a lullaby, haunting and familiar, the kind a mother sings to a child. Ben froze, mesmerized by the sound. "Ben! Don't listen!" Elias roared, reaching up and pulling Ben hard, tumbling him down the hole just as a long, needle-thin black tendril shot out of the gap in the vault door, striking the stone floor where Ben's feet had been a second before. The tendril retracted instantly, leaving behind a streak of smoking, corroded stone. They crashed onto the floor of the furnace. Elias scrambled to slam the iron hatch shut. The metal was burning hot, but he forced it down just as another, heavier impact struck the vault door above. They were in total darkness again, the air unbreathable, the terror suffocating. Elias felt a profound sense of despair and dread. Whatever they had trapped in that vault was not a person or a ghost. It was something that corroded stone, hummed lullabies, and possessed an impossible, patient malice. Ben was coughing violently next to him. "Elias, that humming. I know that song. It was my mother's." Elias shone his weak phone light around the furnace. The room was immense, lined with rusting, intricate pipework and a massive, coal-stained chute leading into a blackened pit. This was it, the incinerator, and leaning against the massive iron hopper, partially obscured by the shadows, was a third figure. It was not Sarah. It was a man, dressed in a tattered, early 20th century asylum uniform. His face was a mask of desiccated skin pulled tight over bone. In his hands, he held a heavy, antique journal, bound in the same leather as the book Sarah had held. He smiled, a dry, crumbling motion that exposed yellowed, ancient teeth. "You've brought new thoughts for the archive," the figure rasped, his voice like the crackle of dry parchment. "The librarian is hungry." The hook for Part 5 will be the direct confrontation with the Asylum figure and the discovery of the original source of the archive's horror. The air in the furnace was suddenly colder, the sulphurous heat giving way to an ancient, bone-deep chill. Elias raised his weapon, the penlight beam shaky as it fixed on the figure in the Asylum uniform. "Police! Drop the book and freeze!" Elias's voice echoed hollowly in the vast, claustrophobic space. The figure, the librarian, didn't move. His smile widened, and he slowly raised the leather-bound journal. The cover was scarred and stained, identical in make to the one Sarah Miller held upstairs, but much older. "Freeze." The librarian's voice was a brittle whisper. "You are already frozen, detective. Frozen in this moment of fear. It's the best time for a withdrawal." He extended a hand, palm up, toward Ben. As he did, the journal in his other hand began to pulse with a dim, sickly luminescence, and the smell of sulfur intensified. Ben gasped, stumbling backward. "My head, it feels like it's squeezing out," Elias reacted instantly. He fired 3 rounds, aiming for the center mass. Crack. Crack. Crack, the shots roared in the confined space. The bullet struck the librarian, but there was no impact, no blood, only a momentary flash of amber light as the round seemed to be absorbed entirely by the air around him. The figure didn't flinch. "Inefficient," the librarian commented, lowering his hand. "The metal archive is not meant for the body, only the mind. You waste your precious ammunition." Elias realized they weren't dealing with a flesh-and-blood man. This was an echo, a conduit, or something far worse. "What are you? What did you do to Sarah Miller?" Elias demanded, reloading on instinct. Though he knew the bullets were useless, the librarian chuckled, a sound like dry leaves scattering. "Sarah. She was an offering. A volunteer. She wanted to hear the dead, but the archive demands payment. She traded her last, loudest thought, the scream of 'run,' for entry into the collection." He turned, gesturing with his journal toward the massive coal chute plunging into the blackened abyss of the incinerator. "This is where the collection began," he said, his voice gaining strength. "The asylum patients. The forgotten. Before this place burned, the doctors understood the power of finality. They didn't just burn the bodies. They burned the final thoughts, the madness, the anguish, the terrible realizations, and stored the resulting energy in a mechanism." Elias's blood ran cold. "The clock." "Precisely. The whispering clock," the librarian confirmed. "It was the key. It wound the archive. But the collection needed a repository." He held up his journal. "This. The original index. It recorded every thought before it was consumed by the fire." He then gestured toward the vault upstairs, where the scratching had momentarily paused. "And now, your friend upstairs has provided a modern update. The new book is full of fresh fear. Your fear. It's time to file it." Suddenly, the floor beneath them began to rumble violently. From the massive coal chute, a sound like 1,000 voices rushing on a gust of wind roared out of the black pit. The air temperature plummeted, Ben cried out, clutching his head and collapsing to his knees. "Elias! It's pulling. It's trying to take my thoughts." Elias knew he had to break the connection, and he had to do it fast. He scanned the furnace, his eyes searching for anything that could disrupt the entity. His gaze fell on a large, rusting gas valve attached to a massive pipe near the coal chute. That if this thing runs on some kind of stored energy, maybe it's still connected to the old asylum power. Ignoring the librarian, Elias sprinted toward the valve. The librarian smiled, unconcerned. "A futile action, detective." He opened the journal on his hand. The pages were blank, but the surface rippled, and a single, clear, devastating thought sprang from the pages: "Your wife died because you missed the sign." The thought wasn't audible, but it slammed into Elias's consciousness with the force of a physical blow. He staggered, dropping his gun. He saw his dead wife's face, her final, despairing look, a memory he had suppressed for years, flashing vividly behind his eyes. "No," Elias choked out, fighting the psychological intrusion. "Yes," the librarian whispered, stepping closer, his presence feeling heavy and solid now. "It's all here. Every secret fear. Every regret. Perfect fuel." Elias scrambled, recovering his gun and reaching the giant valve. He ignored the paralyzing mental assault and threw his weight against the rusted wheel. With a shriek of ancient, stressed metal, the valve handle broke off in his hand. But the valve itself had been turned. Immediately, a torrent of thick, black, noxious ash, the accumulated soot and residue of decades of burning, blasted out of a nearby vent, coating the room. The librarian was momentarily obscured by the cloud of dark dust. More importantly, the massive roar from the coal chute abruptly died. The librarian's journal dimmed, the pulsing light gone, the mental pressure on Elias vanished, and Ben, still slumped on the floor, gave a huge, shuddering gasp for air. Elias had bought them seconds that he pointed his light at the librarian. The figure was still there, covered in thick black ash, but now he seemed less substantial, his edges blurring slightly. He was furious. "You have disturbed the flow, detective. You have ruined the collection," the librarian hissed. "You're not archiving anything," Elias retorted, picking up a heavy, soot-covered piece of discarded pipe. "You're feeding on it." As the librarian lifted his hand to strike, a fresh sound cut through the oppressive silence, a muffled, wet pounding from the iron hatch above them. Something had followed them down. "Too late, detective," the librarian sneered, turning his gaze toward the hatch. "The new index is ready to be filed. And you are here to show the way." The conflict has now moved to the furnace, with the librarian exposed and a new threat entering from above. The muffled, wet pounding on the iron hatch above them intensified. It was erratic and heavy, punctuated by a disturbing, rhythmic squelching sound. Whatever had been trapped in the vault was now trying to force its way into the furnace. The librarian, temporarily weakened but enraged by the blast of ash, turned his focus back to Elias and Ben. "The new book seeks its master," the librarian whispered, stepping forward. "It demands your memories. It demands your finality." He raised his empty hand again, and the pressure on Elias's mind returned, but this time, it was colder, sharper. Instead of deep regret, Elias felt pure, visceral fear, the fear of a police officer confronting his own absolute powerlessness. Elias, still gripping the heavy section of pipe, staggered back toward the massive incinerator chute. He glanced at the librarian's journal, the index, and the key to his survival clicked into place. "You need that journal, don't you?" Elias yelled, his voice strained. "It's not just an index, it's your anchor. It is the history of this place," the librarian shrieked, advancing faster. "It's a control mechanism." Elias countered. He quickly glanced at Ben, who was struggling to stand. "Ben, the librarian is a distraction. The real threat is the book upstairs. If we destroy this journal, maybe we break his connection to the archive." Elias knew the risk was immense, but he had to draw the entity away from his partner. That he feigned a move toward the librarian, then spun and hurled the heavy piece of iron pipe with all his might. He didn't aim for the figure, he aimed for the journal. The pipe hit the librarian's arm with a resounding, brittle crack. The figure recoiled, his ancient uniform shimmering as if struggling to maintain its form. The impact was enough to make him drop the journal. The leather book landed on the dusty floor, springing open. As its blank pages were exposed, the horrific, multi-layered whispers from the archive vault downstairs immediately surged out of the book, filling the furnace with a cacophony of dying screams. The librarian stumbled back, clutching his arm, which now looked like calcified bone wrapped in dry tissue. "Fool! You have exposed the collection." At that moment, the iron hatch above them burst open with a violent clang. A dark, amorphous shape, thick, wet, and glistening with that sickly amber light, slammed onto the floor. It moved with a disturbing speed, a gelatinous mass that quickly pulled itself into a rough, vaguely humanoid shape. It was the book entity, using the consumed energy, Sarah's fear, and the residual energy from the vault, to manifest physically. It didn't have features, only a pulsating core of dark, saturated leather, and its movements were accompanied by the wet, squelching sound they had heard earlier. Elias had been right, the entity had followed the power. It lunged immediately, not for Elias, but for the exposed librarian's journal lying on the floor. "No!" the librarian shrieked, his voice laced with genuine panic. He knew the book entity was not here to obey, it was here to consume the original index and gain full, unstoppable control over the archive. The librarian dove for the journal. Elias, seeing his chance, grabbed Ben and dragged him toward the shadows near the incinerator chute. The two entities met in a chaotic struggle. The librarian was a figure of fading power, using withered hands to guard the journal. The book entity, however, was pure, kinetic horror. It moved with a devastating force, its form rippling as it battered the librarian. Elias and Ben watched, pinned down by terror, as the book entity finally overwhelmed the librarian. It didn't strike or tear, it simply enveloped the figure. The wet, glistening mass of the entity wrapped around the librarian completely. A horrific, sucking sound filled the room, the consumption. The librarian's antique uniform instantly became drenched, and the whispers emanating from the book entity surged into a roaring wave. In seconds, the shape pulled away. The librarian was gone. All that remained was a heap of dry, crumbling ash where the figure had stood, and a new, solid chunk of dark, pulsating material seamlessly incorporated into the book entity's form. The book entity, now larger and radiating a palpable cold, stood motionless over the scene of its consumption. It then slowly, deliberately, picked up the librarian's journal. As the wet, black mass touched the leather cover, the journal instantly fused into the entity's body. The whispers stopped. The pulsating light grew brilliant, a horrifying, steady amber glow. The book entity was no longer just a collection of fear. It was now the archive. And it had achieved its full, consolidated power. It turned its attention to the two remaining figures, the source of new, unfiled thoughts. The air grew impossibly cold. The entity spoke, but not with whispers or screams, but with a new, composite voice, Sarah's terror, the librarian's brittle ancientness, and a deep, grinding bass of pure, consuming malice. The collection is complete. You will be the final entry. The two entities have fused, creating the fully realized archive monster. Elias and Ben are trapped in the furnace with no weapons proven effective. The newly consolidated entity, the archive, stood between Elias and the collapsed tunnel leading back to the sealed vault, radiating a paralyzing aura of cold, focused malice. It was a shifting, obsidian mass, its surface glistening like fresh tar, and somewhere within its core, the remnants of Sarah Miller's clothes and the leather journals were visible, pulsating with sickly amber light. The composite voice, a terrible blend of youth, antiquity, and predatory hunger, echoed in the furnace. The finality of your existence is now required to seal the archive, it stated. Do not resist. Resistance is unnecessary noise. Elias knew running was pointless. He was out of bullets that mattered, and the entity was faster than it looked. He glanced at Ben, who was trying desperately to crawl toward the massive, open maw of the incinerator chute. Ben, wait. Don't go near the chute. Elias hissed, but it was too late. The archive turned its attention to Ben. A thin, black tendril shot out from its mass, not striking, but hovering inches from Ben's temple. The young officer. Your mind is loud with regret for the missed call. A simple, fresh fear. Accept the silence. Ben screamed, a choked, agonizing sound, as his body went rigid. His eyes rolled back, and a faint, shimmering vapor, a translucent, silvery cloud, began to leak from his mouth and nostrils, flowing directly into the hovering tendril. The smell of ozone and burning copper filled the air. The entity was literally withdrawing Ben's consciousness. Elias realized the entity wasn't focused on killing, but on extracting. It was gathering the final, defining thought of its victims. Seeing his partner being consumed, Elias had to act. He lunged for the incinerator chute, grabbing the piece of broken gas valve he still held. The chute was a vertical black shaft, dropping into the abyss. If you want the final entry, you have to follow the process. Elias roared at the archive, hoping to appeal to its twisted, bureaucratic nature. The asylum burned the final thoughts. You have to complete the cycle. The archive paused its consumption of Ben, its amorphous mass rippling with what seemed like confusion. It turned its terrible, featureless attention to Elias. "Explain the process, detective. Incomplete data will be purged." Elias pressed his advantage, knowing this was a desperate gamble. The clock was the key, the journals were the index, and the furnace was the final collection point. You don't just absorb the thoughts, you purify them in the fire to make the archive permanent. He pointed to the incinerator chute. That is the actual heart of the archive. Not the book. The fire. If you don't complete the purification ritual, the knowledge you consumed will decay, and you will revert to scattered fear. It was a complete fabrication, an educated guess based on the librarian's rantings, but the entity hesitated. Its core, the pulsing amber light, flickered. The idea of decay seemed to override its immediate desire for consumption. Proof. The ritual requires the final entry to be submitted to the source, the archive demanded, its voice echoing with the composite knowledge of its victims. Then take the entry. I'll give you my final, purest fear. Elias yelled. He took a single, deliberate step back toward the open chute, placing himself directly on the edge of the incinerator drop. My final thought is not fear of death, archive, Elias said, his voice hard and resolute. He raised the broken, jagged gas valve piece like a weapon, pointing it at the entity's core. It is the certainty that I am going to destroy you. With that, Elias threw himself backward, plummeting into the coal chute, down into the absolute, smothering darkness of the incinerator pit. The archive shrieked, a deafening chorus of pure, frustrated agony. It abandoned Ben, who instantly collapsed, limp but breathing, and surged toward the chute. Error. Unfiled entry. Recall. Recall. The entity threw its body into the opening of the chute, its mass tearing into the blackness after Elias plummeted for what felt like an eternity. The chute was slick with ash and grease, the darkness total. He braced for impact. Instead of stone, he landed on a vast, shifting mountain of decades-old soot and ash. The fall had been broken by the accumulated remains of the Asylum's purification ritual. That he was alive, in the belly of the beast. Above him, the chute groaned under the impossible weight of the archive, which was trying to follow him. Elias shone his penlight into the enormous space that he wasn't in a simple pit. He was in the firebox of the original incinerator, a massive, vaulted chamber lined with rusted iron grates and vents. And in the center of the floor, still glowing faintly red, was the original combustion port. Elias knew what he had to do. He scrambled over the mountain of ash, toward the glowing port. He had to reignite the furnace. He had to finish the purification that the librarian had described. He reached the port. It was the entry point for the fuel, a large, metal-lined hole leading directly to the original fire pit. He looked up at the chute. The black mass of the archive was cascading down, filling the shaft, its terrible voice roaring in his mind. You cannot escape the collection. Your anguish will be consumed. Elias gripped the broken gas valve. He took a deep breath of the choking, acrid air. No, Elias whispered, aiming the valve piece at the combustion port. Your collection is about to be purified. The action now moves to the incinerator pit for the final confrontation, where Elias intends to use the very process that created the entity to destroy it. The archive entity, an immense, flowing wave of black, gelatinous fear, was pouring down the chute, filling the chamber with the deafening chorus of its victims' final thoughts. Elias, half buried in the cold, oily ash, scrambled to the glowing combustion port. He didn't have a match, let alone a flame. He had one chance, the metal piece of the broken gas valve. The combustion port was a rusted circle of iron, faintly emitting residual heat from decades past. Elias thrust the jagged edge of the broken valve handle into the small gap around the port door and levered it open. A rush of intensely hot, stale air blasted out, carrying the faint, unmistakable smell of coal and brimstone. Elias plunged his hand into the opening, digging through the residual coal dust until his fingers scraped against something hard and crystalline. It was a chunk of obsidian, fused with remnants of old electrical wiring, a piece of the Asylum's original power system, left over from the 1920s fire. Elias knew about the old Stonehaven power plant that fed the Asylum. It used high voltage, direct current, DC, arcs to ignite the coal. He looked up at the main incinerator vent, a massive, rusted pipe running parallel to the chute. It was still connected to the city's decommissioned electrical grid. You need energy to maintain that form, archive. You need to feed. Elias shouted, his voice cracking, buying himself time. The archive slammed into the ash pile, a shuddering mountain of despair. Tentacles of black goo shot out, ripping through the ash towards Elias. The archive requires the thought, detective. Submit. Submit. Elias ignored the mental assault. He quickly wound the fine copper wires from the obsidian shard around the piece of the broken gas valve. He then frantically jammed the valve piece into the nearest rusted electrical conduit on the furnace wall, a live wire, years dead, but one that might hold a residual charge from the static buildup in the dry ash. That he didn't need a massive shock. He just needed a spark. That he felt a tiny, painful jolt run up his arm. The obsidian shard, now pressed against the metal conduit, began to hum faintly. Simultaneously, the main mass of the archive reached him. A crushing weight slammed onto his back. He felt the cold, sticky material begin to spread, sealing itself around his legs. The terrifying, composite voice roared directly into his mind, final thought, failure. You failed to save them all. Elias fought back the memory of his wife, focusing only on the sharp, agonizing pain in his hand. That he ripped the wired valve handle free from the conduit, the obsidian trailing a single, microscopic blue spark, with the entity consuming him from the waist down, trapping his limbs in its chilling embrace. Elias twisted, aiming the crude, sparking instrument at the open combustion port. That he thrust the obsidian-tipped valve handle directly into the pit, onto the dry, ancient coal bed, FCZZZZT, 4A. Terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, the static charge combined with the trace sulfur in the pit. The coal dust, dry and compressed for a century, ignited in a brilliant, terrifying flash of blue and white flame. Whom, the instantaneous burst of heat and light was apocalyptic. The furnace roared to life. The fire quickly spread, licking up the walls and roaring out of the combustion port. The archive shrieked, a sound of pure, unholy agony. Fire was the source of its purification ritual, but also its weakness in its current, consolidated form. The heat instantly vaporized the gelatinous parts of its body. Elias felt the black mass release him completely as the entity recoiled, writhing in the intense heat. Decay. Reversal. The collection is tainted, the voices screamed. Elias crawled out of the blast radius, shielding his eyes from the blinding, searing light now filling the chamber. He saw the archive thrash violently, shrinking rapidly. The mass was decomposing, not into smoke, but into a deluge of blackened, oily liquid and thin, fluttering scraps of dry paper, the memories it had stolen, literally evaporating. Crucially, the two journals, the librarian's and Sarah Miller's, which were still fused into its core, were now exposed and burning with the highest intensity. They were the entity's physical anchors. Elias had to make sure the purification was complete. He picked up a piece of metal rebar that had fallen from the ceiling. As the archive melted, it made one last, desperate attempt. A final, distinct image materialized in the air, the terrified, beautiful face of Sarah Miller, her eyes now pleading, her voice clear. Help me, detective. He's still inside the fire. You have to save me. Elias stopped, his heart tearing. It looked and sounded exactly like her. Then, he remembered the horrifying smile, the lack of struggle, and the librarian's words, "She was an offering." This was not Sarah, it was the entity using the last, freshest piece of its collection to manipulate him. "You are not Sarah Miller," Elias choked out, tears of ash and sweat streaming down his face. "You are the echo of her final thought." He lunged forward one last time, ignoring the searing heat, and plunged the metal rebar into the burning, pulsating core of the archive, pinning the melting mass to the floor of the furnace. A final, deafening crack, like 1,000 whips, tore through the chamber. The fire flared white, and then, silence. The fire immediately subsided to a low, steady burn, focused only on the coal. The oppressive cold, the sulfuric smell, and the overwhelming noise vanished. The large, vaulted chamber was empty, save for the remaining soot, the raging heat, and a few scorched, oily streaks on the floor. Elias staggered back, coughing, his hands scorched. He had survived that. He looked up at the open coal chute. The way was clear. He quickly climbed out of the pit and scrambled back toward the entrance of the furnace. Ben Carter was still lying near the hatch, motionless, but breathing. The silvery vapor was gone. Elias knelt beside him, checking his pulse. It was weak, but steady. Ben was alive, but deeply unconscious. A new noise reached Elias's ears, not scratching, but a frantic pounding and shouting. It was the outside world. The sealing of the archive had ended the interference. Central had finally reached them. Elias grabbed his radio, his voice a raw whisper of victory and exhaustion. "Central, this is Unit 31. The situation is contained. Repeat, the threat is neutralized. Send paramedics and a heavy recovery team to the Blackwood Library sublevel immediately. We need to breach the vault. 2 officers down. 1 missing person, unaccounted for." Elias knew the truth. Sarah Miller was gone. But her final echo, her ultimate fear, was finally silent. The main entity is destroyed, but the consequences of the ritual remain, and the psychological scars are deep. The roar of the furnace fire was quickly replaced by the sounds of the outside world, the low thrumming of generators, the distant wail of sirens, and the sound of heavy equipment being dragged down the stone stairs. Elias sat on the cold concrete floor next to the unconscious Ben, his own body shaking with shock and fatigue. He used his flashlight to inspect Ben. His partner's skin was clammy, but the terrible tension was gone from his features. He looked exhausted, not consumed. The extraction team, heavily armed and wearing hazmat gear, a precaution the police chief had wisely ordered, finally breached the steel vault door. The sound was deafening, a victory against the iron sarcophagus that had sealed their fate. Chief Helen Vance, a woman whose professionalism was matched only by her skepticism, was the first through the gap. She took one look at the melted section of the vault door, the dark, oily residue on the floor, and the faint, sulphurous smell hanging in the air, and her skepticism evaporated. "Dear God, Thorne! What in the hell happened down here?" Elias gave a terse, official report, stripping the narrative of the supernatural. "A massive internal electrical fire, Chief. High-voltage surge in the decommissioned incinerator below. Subject Sarah Miller and 1 other unidentified individual were involved in a break-in and subsequent containment failure. Officer Carter is stable but requires immediate medical attention." He intentionally omitted the librarian, the whispering clock, and the consumption. He knew the files would never be sealed if he mentioned a sentient fear-eating entity. Ben was carefully stretchered out, his unconscious face shielded from the floodlights. Elias then led the team to the furnace. They found only the melted rebar, the scorched earth, and a massive pile of ash. No body, no journal, no trace of the entity or the librarian. The evidence was self-purified. The only thing they found of significance was in a confinement chamber, the room where Sarah had been sitting. Once the room was cleared and ventilated, Elias was allowed one final look. The iron chains on the wall, the deep stains, and the concentric runes on the floor were still there. But the stone pillar, the one covered in the hundreds of screaming, scratch-drawn faces, was clean. The carvings were gone. Only the smooth, cold stone remained, as if it had been perfectly polished. The erasure was absolute. Elias shone his light one last time at the spot where Sarah Miller had been sitting. He noticed something small tucked into the fold of a dusty, unused uniform left on a shelf, a piece of hotel stationery folded neatly. It was from the Stonehaven Grand Hotel that he picked it up. Written in Sarah Miller's careful, looping handwriting were two simple sentences: "I heard it." It promised to listen. And at the very bottom, scrawled in a frantic, hurried hand, a single, final phrase, one that froze the blood in Elias's veins: "The archive only accepts new entries now. Check the foundation." Elias quickly pocketed the note. It was the only concrete proof he had of the horror, and he knew he could never submit it to the police file. The Foundation. It was the local name for the city's main historical society, currently building a new headquarters downtown, right over the old asylums and used waterworks and cisterns that he left the Blackwood Library archive just as the sun was beginning to rise, painting the fog-shrouded city in sickly orange and gray. He was exhausted, but one thing was terribly clear: the entity may have been destroyed, but the system it belonged to, the cycle of consumption and purification, was still active. The horror had simply found a new location that a month later, Elias was back on duty, having been officially decorated for extreme bravery in containing a volatile industrial accident. Ben Carter was in recovery, suffering from severe psychological trauma and temporary memory loss. Doctors called it a fugue state. Elias sat in his car, nursing a bitter black coffee. He was on watch outside the Stonehaven Historical Foundation construction site. The city was digging the foundation for the new building, and the sound of heavy drills and excavation was continuous. That he pulled out the note. The archive only accepts new entries now. He knew what he had to do. He had to follow the trail left by the purified entity before it could rebuild itself in a new location. Elias watched as a construction crane lifted a large, rusted chunk of metal from the deep, waterlogged excavation pit, a piece of antique machinery wrapped in ancient, crumbling stone. The kind of foundation work that often uncovered the city's forgotten secrets. As the crane swung the piece over the site, the radio on Elias's dashboard suddenly erupted with a burst of sharp, aggressive static. It was the same static from the vault, but louder, angrier, and mixed with a faint, metallic clanking sound. Then, a new voice cut through, clear, composed, and terribly familiar. It was the composite voice of the archive, but focused, distilled, like a perfectly tuned instrument. "Detective Thorne. You should have remained silent. Now, you are the first new entry for the Stonehaven Foundation collection." Elias slammed his hand onto the ignition. He was too late. The system had found him. The new horror has relocated to a high-profile, currently active location, and the entity has established a direct link to Elias. The structure of the story is set for a continuous investigation and escalating horror. Elias Thorne felt a sickening lurch in his stomach. The voice in his radio was impossible, a digital echo of the composite horror he had witnessed melting in the furnace. It wasn't just static, it was a targeted, confident transmission. That he threw the gear into drive and sped across the street, skidding to a halt near the chain-link fence surrounding the Stonehaven Historical Foundation site. The site was a chaotic mix of mud, massive earth movers, and steel scaffolding. Construction workers, recognizable by their neon vests, were milling around the enormous pit. Elias jumped out of the car, flashing his badge at the foreman, a burly man named Gus. "Stop all drilling. Now. Emergency police action." Gus glared at him. "Hey, detective, we got permits. You can't just shut down a $50 million project. I just contained a high-voltage chemical fire that leveled a police archive," Elias interrupted, his voice cutting through the noise. "This site is compromised." "What was that piece of scrap the crane just pulled out?" Gus shrugged, pointing to a dark, stone-encased object resting on a temporary platform. "Old cistern gear. Looks like a pump. Found it deep in the water table, right where the old Asylum service tunnels ran." "Why?" Elias approached the object. It was a massive, rusted iron mechanism, encased in a rough, porous stone. It was covered in mud and smelled strongly of stagnant water, but even through the grime, Elias recognized the antique, brutalist style of the Asylum's machinery. More chillingly, wrapped tightly around the main iron cylinder, was a thin, delicate film of what looked like dried leather. "The archive only accepts new entries now." Elias instinctively reached for his police radio. "Central, I need a detailed structural breakdown of the Stonehaven Foundation site. Focus on any subterranean water tunnels, especially those leading away from the old Blackwood Library area." His radio immediately screamed static, louder and angrier than before. The composite voice returned, a cold, mocking presence in the sound. "The flow is secure, detective. The channel is open. And the new collection space is quite impressive." Elias slammed the radio down on the hood of his car. The entity was using the rusted metal and the deep pit to anchor itself and interfere with communications, just like the vault that he turned to the foreman. "Gus, is anyone down in the pit right now?" "Yeah, my son, Mike. He's down near the west wall, doing geological mapping." "Why?" Elias didn't answer. He grabbed a coil of rope from a supply truck and raced to the edge of the pit. It was a sheer drop of over 50 feet, and at the bottom, the floor was uneven, muddy, and dotted with exposed, ancient stone foundation supports that he found Mike, a young man with a helmet and a survey stick, working near a deep, narrow fissure in the west wall. "Mike! Get out of there! Now!" Elias shouted down. Mike looked up, confused. "What?" "I'm almost done with the readings, detective." Suddenly, the fissure behind Mike widened with a sickening crack, and a jet of thick, foul-smelling water burst out, drenching him. The water was black, oily, and seemed impossibly cold. As it hit Mike, he didn't just stumble, he became rigid, dropping his tools, his hands flying to his head, screaming that it was the same exact reaction Ben had had in the furnace. The archive was withdrawing his thoughts, using the contaminated water as its conduit. Elias looped the rope quickly around a nearby structural beam. He had to get down there. "Gus! Get the crane operator. Ready a heavy lift. Don't come down here." Elias yelled, before rappelling over the edge and sliding down the rope, kicking off the muddy wall. He hit the bottom with a jarring impact and raced toward Mike, who was convulsing violently in the black, flowing water. As Elias reached him, Mike's eyes rolled back, and he began to emit a low, bubbling sound. The black water, which had drenched Mike's legs, was now churning, and out of the black liquid, a distinct shape began to rise. It wasn't gelatinous and amorphous like the previous manifestation. This was solid, heavy, and industrial. It was an iron cylinder, a rusting, archaic pump head, dripping with black slime, but its rotating vanes were turning with unnatural speed and efficiency. It was the original Asylum water pump, and it was alive. The pump head, covered in a thin, dark leather-like film, was sucking the water in, and with it, the silvery vapor of Mike's consciousness. The archive had found a new, stronger vessel, an industrial heart of iron and stone. Elias grabbed Mike under the arms and yanked him hard out of the stream of black water. As he did, the pump head turned its rusted, mechanical face toward Elias. "Welcome to the new index, Detective Thorne. We begin the filing with the first new thought, your failure to save the young worker. A piercing, high-frequency whine emanated from the spinning pump vanes, slamming into Elias's skull. The pain was blinding, worse than the whispers. It was a focused, mechanical torture designed to break him instantly. Elias dragged Mike toward the base of the foundation, seeking any kind of cover from the noise and the pump's terrible attention. He looked up at the vast, yawning depth of the excavation site that he was trapped 70 feet underground with the newest, most resilient incarnation of the archive. And it was anchored to the literal heart of the new construction site. The archive has successfully relocated and taken on a new, mechanical form. Elias is now trapped deep underground with a victim. The high-frequency whine emanating from the rusted pump head was unbearable, a mechanical scream designed to shatter nerve endings. Elias, shielding Mike's head and his own, desperately dragged them both behind a massive, partially unearthed stone block, a piece of the asylum's original foundation wall. The archive, now manifesting as the pump, didn't pursue them immediately. It rotated slowly on the spot, its iron casing dripping with black water, its spinning vanes still emitting that debilitating sonic attack. Elias pressed his face against the cold, damp stone. He could still feel the entity's presence in his mind, but the whine was less about extracting fear and more about maintaining control over the environment. "It's anchored," Elias gasped, pushing himself up. He looked at the vast pit. This new form was stronger, more durable, and intrinsically tied to the city's infrastructure through the water table. Mike was still breathing, but entirely unresponsive. The silvery vapor was gone, the fear had been filed. Elias knew he couldn't destroy this thing with fire or physical force. The pump was heavy iron, and they were 70 feet down, with no tools and no communication. That he looked at the fissure where the contaminated water was pouring from. The flow was constant, feeding the pump, acting as its circulation system. The source had to be the old asylum's main cistern, the center of the waterworks that he had to disrupt the flow. Elias saw a narrow, vertical maintenance shaft, a dry well, next to the foundation block they were hiding behind. It looked barely wide enough for a man, dropping even deeper into the earth. It was a forgotten access point to the cistern level. "We go down, Mike," Elias muttered, hoisting the unconscious man onto his shoulders. "We go to the source." As he moved toward the shaft, the pump sensed his change in location. It turned, and one of its vanes, sharp and rusted, detached itself from the spinning mechanism and shot through the air, embedding itself deep into the stone block where they had been hiding. The silence that followed the impact was worse than the noise. The pump was learning to project its attack. Elias lowered Mike gently into the narrow shaft. "Stay still. I'll be right back for you." He quickly followed, his boots scraping against the slick, ancient stone. He descended about 20 feet into the complete blackness until he landed on a rough, narrow ledge. He activated his penlight. The beam revealed an access tunnel, a cramped, low, stone-lined passage, its floor inches deep in clear, stagnant water. The air was cold, the silence immense. Elias pushed forward, crawling through the tunnel. The silence was unnerving, broken only by his own ragged breathing and the distant, rhythmic clanking sound. Clank. 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 That he reached the end of the passage and found himself in a vast, dark chamber, the asylum cistern. The chamber was cylindrical, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into the darkness. The whole space was dominated by a huge, murky pool of water, reflecting the penlight beam in unsettling ways. The clanking was coming from the center of the pool. Elias aimed his light, his heart sinking with dread. In the middle of the cistern, half submerged in the dark water, was another piece of colossal, rusted machinery, a multi-piston hydraulic press. It was chained to the cistern floor, moving slowly up and down with terrifying precision, and beneath the press, resting on a stone pedestal, was a small, delicate object, the whispering clock. The clanking was the sound of the hydraulic press slowly, agonizingly crushing the small, antique clock. Clank. Pause. Clank. Pause. Every time the press descended, the clock didn't break. Instead, a surge of brilliant, concentrated amber light shot out through the water, followed by a shockwave of cold. The clock was being compressed, not destroyed, its stored energy being concentrated into a critical mass. This was the archive's true power core, the subterranean heart. It wasn't just collecting fear, it was synthesizing the ultimate form of finality. By crushing the original power source, Elias understood the strategy. The pump was the collector and anchor, the cistern was the synthesis chamber. Once the clock was fully crushed, the archive would be permanently empowered, anchored forever to the city's foundation. Elias had seconds. He had to stop the press that he spotted a huge, rusting flywheel on the wall, connected by a series of gears and belts to the press mechanism. He scrambled onto a narrow, slippery walkway, rushing toward the flywheel. As he reached it, the pump's voice echoed, reverberating through the cistern walls, cold and amused. Admirable, detective. You found the heart of the collection. Now, witness the final entry. Elias looked back toward the pool. The black, contaminated water that had drenched Mike was now flowing down the tunnel he had just traversed, spilling into the cistern. The water was carrying a fresh, silvery wisp of vapor, Mike's essence. The vapor flowed directly into the hydraulic press. As it was absorbed, the heavy machinery suddenly sped up, its speed doubling. Clank, clank, clank. The press was descending rapidly now, moments away from crushing the clock. Elias threw his body against the huge flywheel, his hands grabbing the cold, rough metal. He strained every muscle, trying to turn the wheel and disengage the press clutch. The wheel groaned, the chains snapped tight, and Elias felt a searing pain rip through his shoulder. He was turning it, but too slowly. Failure. Failure. Failure, the composite voice chanted, growing louder, more triumphant. In his mind, Elias saw the massive metal plate of the press smash down onto the clock. Crunch, the climax is now centered on the destruction of the entity's core power source. The sound of the hydraulic press crushing the whispering clock was not a shattering sound, but a deafening, wet implosion. A terrifying silence followed, then a shockwave of cold, agonizing energy blasted outward, striking Elias and sending him staggering back against the cistern wall. The amber light was gone. The water in the pool churned violently, then suddenly became clear, clean, and still. The hydraulic press, now motionless, began to rapidly rust and decay, reverting to inert, dead iron. Elias had failed. The clock was destroyed, and the fear had been synthesized. The finality is achieved, the composite voice roared in Elias's mind, no longer an echo, but a permanent, terrible presence. The archive is now the foundation. Elias slumped against the wet stone, defeated. The entity had won. It was anchored permanently to the city's heart, ready to feed on the terror of Stonehaven for centuries to come. Then, he heard a new sound, a low, grinding groan that came not from the machinery, but from the surrounding stone. The purification ritual had worked too well. By compressing and synthesizing the fear of a century, the madness, the anguish, the terrible final thoughts of the asylum patients, the archive had overloaded its own containment. The massive stone walls of the cistern, the very foundation of the new construction site, were cracking. A fissure, thicker than Elias's arm, shot up the vaulted wall, followed by a torrent of clean, rushing water. The city's active water main, ruptured by the explosive synthesis. The archive had secured its power, but it had fatally destabilized its new home. The pump, still anchored 70 feet above them in the excavation pit, began to issue a new sound, a frantic, high-pitched squeal of metal shearing against metal. The pump's iron shell began to deform and twist. No. Decay. The anchor is compromised, the voice shrieked in Elias's mind. The entity was stable, but its new vessel was tearing itself apart under the stress of the collapsing foundation and the relentless pressure of the rushing water. Elias saw his chance. The archive was still anchored to the iron pump, and the pump was now connected to a collapsing structure and a torrent of water that he scrambled back along the narrow walkway, towards the dry well shaft where he had left Mike. "You took my partner's mind, you consumed Sarah Miller." Elias roared into the darkness, his voice echoing over the rising sound of rushing water and cracking stone. "You wanted finality. This is it." He reached the dry well, pulled himself back up, and found Mike, still unconscious, but breathing. Elias hoisted him onto his back. The water was now flowing into the tunnel in a strong current that he began the grueling climb out of the maintenance shaft. As Elias reached the top, he looked out into the main excavation pit. The scene was pure chaos. Gus the foreman was yelling at the crane operator. The black water had stopped flowing, replaced by a massive geyser of clean, pressurized water from the broken main, and in the center of the pit, the pump was thrashing violently, the heavy iron tearing itself apart as the ground shifted beneath it. Elias pulled Mike out of the shaft and laid him safely by the foundation wall. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the rope they had used earlier and sprinted toward the main power control panel for the entire construction site, a massive steel box bolted to a scaffold. "Central, this is Thorne. We have a critical structural collapse at the foundation site. I need the entire block power grid shut down. Do it now." He didn't wait for a response. He found the main safety lever, ripped off the protective cover, and plunged his hand into the complex tangle of live wires. He grabbed the two main lines leading directly to the waterlogged excavation equipment that he didn't need a surge. He needed a short. Elias scraped the two thick wires together. A brilliant blue flash erupted, followed by the deep, resonant thum of the entire power grid on the block dying instantly. The electrical current shot directly into the waterlogged earth of the excavation pit, hitting the thrashing iron pump. The short circuit was the final shock. The iron structure of the pump, already weakened by the synthesis and the collapsing foundation, glowed white-hot for a searing instant, and then, with a sound like a wet balloon bursting, the pump exploded. It didn't explode with shrapnel, but with water and steam, and a final, blinding burst of pure amber light that vaporized everything it touched. The light was so intense that Elias was thrown backward, landing hard on the muddy ground, momentarily blinded. When his vision cleared, the pump was gone. The excavation pit was filling rapidly with clear, rushing water. All was silent, save for the sound of the ruptured main and the shouts of the construction workers. The Black Terror was washed away. Epilogue. 3 months later, the Stonehaven Foundation site was officially declared a geological hazard due to an unforeseen structural fault and sealed permanently. Sarah Miller remained a cold case, officially listed as a victim of a suspected murder. Ben Carter never fully recovered. He quit the force, unable to shake the pervasive, terrifying silence in his mind. Elias Thorne was back on patrol. The fear was gone, the horror silent. But sometimes, when he drove past the now flooded, abandoned construction site, he felt a faint, nagging presence, not fear, but a cold incompleteness that he still carried. Sarah Miller's note: "The archive only accepts new entries now. Check the foundation." Elias had destroyed the foundation. But he knew the essence of the archive, the final, synthesized thought of a century, had not been destroyed.